It's my pleasure to welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, Building Tomorrow's Best Leaders Today. Please welcome author, professor and scholar, Dr. Kim Cameron. How are you, Kim?
I'm great, Tony. Thank you very much for having me on.
It's my pleasure. And once again, anything about energy and leadership, I love to hear about, and I'm sure our listeners do as well. But before we dive into your book and the work that you've done, tell me a little bit about the Dr. Kim Cameron story.
Thank you, Tony. Well, I am a professor at the University of Michigan in the Ross School of Business. I have been at Michigan for 25 years or more, long time. About 20 years ago, we created a research center here, primarily as a result of having me doing research on downsizing, consolidation, retrenchment, and so on. What I learned from that research, it was about 10 years or so of research. What I learned from that research is that almost all organizations, when they downsize, deteriorate in performance. Turnover goes up. Trust goes down, communication channels get restricted, good leaders leave. I mean, all kinds of bad things happen. Well, that's typical of about 80 or 85% of organizations that downsize. However, that leaves 10 or 15% that flourished after downsizing. And the question became, well, how do you explain those who flourish compared to almost everybody else? Well, I didn't have real hard data, but I had an impression, a growing impression, that the difference was the institutionalization of virtuous practices. I mean, compassion, forgiveness, trust, integrity, generosity, and so on, all embedded in the organizations. Now, the trouble is, that was not a legitimate topic to even discuss, back then.
Yeah.
But I gave a presentation in a conference, assuming that they would laugh me off the stage. But I got a phone call after that presentation saying, you know what, there's a foundation funding research on forgiveness. And we sort of thought that was one of the topics you were talking about. So would you like to apply for this research grant? I said, of course. So I applied, got a research grant. I was the only non-psychologist that they funded, because they essentially said, we know about forgiveness at an individual level, but in organizations, is there something called collective forgiveness, for heaven's sake? Well, as it turns out, that started my research in this area. I have a good friend, colleague, who is also doing research on compassion in organization.
Yeah.
Not only individuals, but organizational compassion and so on. So we ended up creating a center. And the reason is, we said to ourselves, we can keep doing our own research independently, but we ought to learn from each other. And the best way we knew to learn from each other was to create a center, which we did, called now the Center for Positive Organization. So we're studying how all these dynamics, I refer to them as virtuous practices, how all these dynamics affect organizations and their employees and the performance, bottom line performance. So that's sort of how I began this process. And then for the last 20 years, we've been having a lot of fun trying to understand what's going on that dimension.
I can imagine. And, some of those traits that you talked about, things like compassion, kindness, and those virtuous dynamics, I think you mentioned, it's really interesting because so many leaders out there potentially don't even look at that sort of stuff, that it's a business mode, it's just business, it's that sort of a mindset. So what sort of response have you had within the business community around some of the challenges and changes that you would envisage in better organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. And here's what I've discovered. More often than not, executives, attorneys, scientists, engineers say to me something like this: look, Cameron, I got bottom line impact that I got to pay attention to. I got sales targets. I got stock price goals. I got customer satisfaction issues. I mean, this soupy, syrupy, saccharine sweet positivity stuff substanceless. I mean, you're just telling me to think happy thoughts, be cheerful, smile, and everything's going to be okay. Well, it's not okay. So, over the last 20 years, one of the things that I've spent most of the time doing is trying to make the business case, the empirical, valid case, that sure enough, positive practices affect bottom line performance, profitability, productivity, quality, innovation, customer satisfaction, and so on. And so my response generally is, all right, well, let me show you the data. Let me show you the evidence that this actually matters in areas where you're held accountable.
And I would imagine that that's got a level of influence then that you've been able to share the data. And part of what I'm sort of thinking about at the moment, Kim, is really about some of this makes sense to me, and there's an intuition that the better we treat our people, the greater that they enjoy coming to work, the better those things, the better the business goes, the better the performance, the greater the profits, the greater the customer satisfaction. But to be able to have the data behind you is what I guess the majority of business leaders are looking for, because up until then, they're probably just seeing it as, and I love that terminology, that saccharine sweet of positivity. And I'm hoping that with that data, you're able to then persuade some of those other leaders to actually look into it at least and invest some time in processing it.
It's true. In fact, that's the main motivation, Tony, why I've written this book, is that I felt like it needed to be available in the public domain, the research, the empirical case, the evidence that virtuous practices actually pay off. And you mentioned that there is an inherent tendency, in fact, toward virtuousness. In fact, let me give you a quick study that I like a lot and then explain it. So in this particular study, they took children ages 3 months to 8 months old. I mean, long before they learn language and socialization and so on. And they put a child on a caregiver's lap, have the child watch a puppet show for maybe 20 seconds or so. So a puppet tries to walk across the stage, tries to climb a hill, tries to open a box. Then you have 2 other puppets. One puppet tries to help, encourage, support. The other tries to hinder, puts a block up, you can't make it up the hill, jumps on the box, you can't open the box. Then, after 20 seconds or so, you bring these 2 puppets out and put it in front of the child. The child can select whichever puppet he or she wants to play with. Turns out more than 90% of the time, the child will select the puppet that tries to help rather than tries to hinder. And the conclusion of the study, which was published in Nature magazine, one of the most prestigious scientific journals, conclusion of the study is from the time you are 3 months old, from the time a human being is 3 months old, there is an inherent tendency toward virtuousness and away from the reverse, toward positive, away from negative. And that can be explained, and that's part of the purpose of that book, that can be explained by something called the heliotropic effect. Now, What in the world is that? Well, if you put a plant in the window, over time it will lean toward the light, which is an example of the heliotropic effect, which is defined as follows. Every living system, everything alive, has a tendency toward light and away from dark, or toward positive energy, away from negative energy. See, in nature, the sun is the source of positive energy. It's the life-giving force. I mean, photosynthesis happens only in the presence of light. So, most accurately defined, the heliotropic effect is every living system has a tendency toward that which is life-giving and away from that which is life-depleting. Now, if that's true, it has big implication for how we treat our people and our organizations, what kind of incentive systems we put in place, how we rear our children, and so on. So I felt like it was important to highlight the scientific evidence that shows that the heliotropic effect is also typical of human beings. Now, starting in the 1800s, they were talking about heliotropic effect with plants, but it's never been applied to human behavior. And now there's an abundance of research that suggests that human beings are heliotropic, that is, inherent tendencies toward the positive, and that virtuousness fosters.
I'm guessing that most people would understand that we're attracted and drawn to energy. So people that do have an energetic approach to life, they're enthusiastic, that sort of a attitude is incredibly contagious. And it's interesting, the research that you're doing, Dr. Kim, because from a layman, I don't do the same research, obviously, that you do, but I look at, there's two sort of fields that are developing within the world at the moment from some of the people that I have in my network. One is the concept of positive psychology, which is moving ahead in leaps and bounds, and there's some practitioners of that I've interviewed on this particular podcast. But then there's also a school of thought that talks about this concept of toxic positivity, and I sort of get a bit nonplussed about that particular term, and I'd be really grateful to hear your understanding of that phrase, toxic positivity. And how that can be addressed, or if it even exists.
I do believe it exists primarily as a product of disingenuous, inauthentic practices or claims about the positive or about positivity.
Yeah.
That is, I've had individuals say to me, look, I'm under stress. In fact, I was talking to the head of a cardiovascular center just this week. And he was saying, we've got this lineup of people who need our beds. We've got people who are so stressed. We have individuals who have now retired early because it's just overwhelming for them. And that leaves a lot more pressure on the people who remain. And I mean, this is worse than I've ever seen it anywhere. And to have you walk in, or anybody, not me, but have somebody walk in and say, well, just be happy. Just think positive thoughts. Just count the rainbows. He said that just drives us crazy. Well, it's because it's a tool or a technique. It's not authentic, and it's not realistic. I mean, I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. When I'd been married for about a year, now, parenthetically, I have been now married more than 50 years. I have married an angel. She's absolutely spectacular. But I'd been married a year or so. She said to me, don't use that technique on me. I've read your stuff. It's okay. I got it. I mean, look, come on, be authentic, be sincere. So toxic positivity can just be a whole bunch of positive practices that drive people crazy. It's not helpful, not authentic. There's a wonderful study done showing that organizations in particular, or teams in particular, flourish the most when they have a ratio of about 3, maybe up to 5 positive inputs, positive conversations, positive activities for every negative. Now, it was 3 to 1 or 5 to 1. It's not 5 to 0. It's not absent correction, negativity, problem solving, and so on. But it's not. But it's dominated on the positive side. Now, the ratio is between about 3 and about 8. Above 8, it's too syrupy. I mean, I think it becomes toxic positivity. It's just way, way too soupy, Yeah. So there's some evidence that suggests that the human beings and organizations flourish most when there's that kind of a ratio. A 3 to 1 or up to 5 to 1. 5 to 1 would be absolutely ideal, but at least 3 to 1, So toxic positivity to me, by the way, is either insincere or just unrealistic because it's too much. Pouring too much.
And I guess in many ways it's like conflict. There's a certain level of conflict that we need in the workplace to actually generate good performance and to actually generate the best performance. But then there's that balancing act, too little conflict, and we've got a really false sort of a culture, and people are potentially walking around on eggshells because they don't want to upset people. And then too much conflict, and you've got things flying around the room like insults and staplers and all of that sort of stuff. So So I'm sensing that it's a very similar thing. We need to have a positive approach, and we need to be open-minded towards that. But by the same token, we are going to have those times where there may be a negative interaction, or there may be a negative conversation, or something similar. So
it's really true. And excuse me. And it also depends on the way in which the negative is delivered. So, if you take a 3-to-1 ratio or a 5-to-1 ratio, it's not 5-to-0, it's not 50-to-1. There's a 1 that you got to pay attention to. But in general, providing negative or corrective feedback has a high probability, at least a high danger, of creating one of two problems. One is something called simply defensiveness. I feel attacked. I feel like you're coming after me. And my general response is to protect myself or to fight back. Or the second factor, the second response is something called disconfirmation. In other words, I'm feeling worthless. I'm feeling completely incompetent. I'm feeling like it's not worth pursuing. In which case, I probably will withdraw. I'll just get out of here because I can't maintain my integrity or my self-awareness. So the question then is, well, how do I deliver negative feedback? How do I correct somebody without having them either A, feel defensive, or B, disconfirmed? And so there are techniques or tools that just help, help maintain positivity, but at the same time get problem solved. The concept that occurs to me that I've written about a little bit is something called supportive communication. That is, here's how you deliver the one or the negative feedback in a way that elevates a person, that is, helps strengthen the relationship rather than diminish it. So there's some tools or techniques. I mean, I could talk about those, but you may have other questions that we ought to pursue instead of that.
And I guess part of my process is to help understand, or help leaders understand, if I'm a natural leader that may not feel as energetic or as motivated as what I would like to be, I guess what are some of those tips and strategies that you would potentially advise them to be looking at or jumping into to help with that energy? Because while I understand that communication is I think communication flows through energy anyway. So I think the most important thing that I'm wanting to sort of tap into, Kim, is that concept of energy for a leader, because I think that has just got so many benefits for the leader, their team, and the overall performance of the business. So what were some of those tips, I guess, that how you work with leaders to help them engage that energy and the energy levels?
Thank you, Tony. That's a great question, and a rich kind of question with lots of dimensions to it. Excuse me. And the book was written specifically to try to explain why energy, or number one, explain what energy is, and number two, why it's so important. Because some of the major findings that have occurred from our studies is that positive energy is a very important predictor of organization performance, the positive energy of the leader, but also of other people. So let me back off from that and explain what I'm talking about. There are lots of kinds of energy. One's called physical energy, which when I use it, it diminishes. I mean, if I run a marathon, I can't do it again. I got to have recovery time. Emotional energy is the same. I mean, when I use it, I get an intense interaction or something, I get tired. I got to have recuperation time. Mental energy is the same. That's why we have semester breaks. That's why we have weekends, is try to refresh. The only kind of energy that elevates with use is called relational energy. That is, when you get exhausted by being around a person with whom you have a loving, supportive relationship. That's renewing. In fact, when I get exhausted at the end of a week with those other forms of energy, I seek out a relational energy source, and it just renews me. So we do research on relational energy. Now, what does that mean? That means when I interact with Tony, what happens to my energy? Am I uplifted, elevated? Is he life-giving? Or is he exhausting, depleting? It just sucks the life right out of me, in which case, the energizer. So we can generate measures in an organization of who the energizers are, who the de-energizers are, and so on. All right, well, who cares? What's that got to do with anything? Turns out, I'll just tell you 3 of the findings that have emerged from this research. Finding number 1, or at least a finding number 1, is positive energizers, those rated as energizing other people in their relationships, have higher performers than the norm, than the average, by a big factor. But here's the most important part of that research. A person's position in the energy network, that is, I can draw a picture of an organization with an organization chart, and normally the leader's in the top box. I can also draw a picture of an organization using a network map, like in the back of an airline magazine. So some cities were at the hub, some in the periphery. I can do that with energy in an organization. Turns out, energy is 4 times more important in predicting performance than influence and than information. That is, normally the leadership literature, in fact, I would get 90% of the leadership literature equates influence and leadership. If you're influential, that means you're a leader by definition. However, energy is 4 times more important in predicting performance than influence or information, which is interesting because organizations are always managing information. I mean, did you come to the meeting? Did you get the memo? Do you understand where we're going? And they're always managing influence. Here's the incentive system. Here's the target. Here's the goals. Get the numbers. The question is, does anybody ever manage energy? Because it's 4 times more important. Does anybody ever get hired or recognized or promoted or rewarded for being a positive energizer? Hardly ever. We don't even know that resource exists. All right, that's finding number 1.
Yeah.
Finding number 2. So if Tony is a positive energizer and I can just get around him, my performance goes up. That is, positive energizers affect the performance of everyone around them. And there's lots of examples of that. I mean, frequently a professional sports team will hire somebody who's maybe not an all-star in the field, but they need him for the locker room, for the clubhouse. There's in the United States, there's a baseball team, the Houston Astros. They've been playing the World Series 3 out of the last 5 years. There was a book written saying we think we can attribute 10 wins a season to the hiring of Carlos Beltran. Carlos Beltran is kind of over the hill. He used to be an all-star, no longer. But they said we need him in the clubhouse because he's keeping the Spanish speakers and the English speakers together. He's creating a culture of unity as opposed to, we come from different ethnicities. We're not going to relate to each other. So that's just an example of that second point. Positive energizers affect the performance of others around them. Third finding, the highest performing organizations have at least 3 times more positive energizers than normal organizations. That is, you just don't want the top person being a positive energizer. You want everybody, or as many as possible, to be a positive energizer. And so one of the most important findings is positive energy is a set of behaviors. It's not personality. It's not extroversion or introversion. It's not charisma. It's not attractiveness. It's a set of behaviors that anybody can learn. So what we've discovered is the highest performing organizations have a lot of positive energizers. And in fact, it's one of the most important factors that we've discovered to help organizations change and or improve, especially difficult change like changing the culture. So, for example, if you don't mind, I'll keep talking.
Okay, keep going.
Well, listen, your questions are more stimulating than my answers, so I appreciate your questions. I'll just give you one example of how positively energizing people can make a difference.
Yep.
So I'll just give you, I'm going to tell you just one story of many. So we were involved in an organization. It was the world's largest university consortium. This organization owned 69 universities in 12 different regions in the world. Central and South America, Australia, New Zealand, Middle East, Europe, Far East, Africa, and so on. Many of those were the best universities in the countries in which they existed.
Yeah.
Well, they decided, this is a long story, but they decided they wanted to become a positive organization. They wanted to create a positive culture in this worldwide organization. 135,000 staff members. So, we got the presidents and chancellors of all these universities together. As part of that 2 or 3 day session, we said, we want you to identify your positive energizers in your region of the world. What does that mean? That means people who uplift, elevate, who give life to the system. So you don't have to measure that. You just kind of know who they are. So give us the names. They identified 46 people around the world. We brought them together. It was the first time many of them had ever been to the United States, and they were by no means the senior executives in these places.
Yeah.
We gave them about a day's worth of training, or a day and a half or so worth of training about what's positivity and what are the options for activities and tools and techniques, and what's the theory and what's the evidence, and so on. Then we gave them an assignment. The assignment we referred to as a 90 in 90 challenge. So we said to them, we want you to infect 90% of the rest of this organization with positive practices, abundance culture, virtuousness, and we want you to do it in 90 days. 90 in 90. Well, we didn't give them a prescription. We didn't give them a cookbook with checking off things. We just turned them loose. And it was among the most inspiring things you can imagine. I mean, these folks, by the way, 90 days later, they had infected 96% of 135,000 people. They held all kinds of events. And I mean, it was amazing. Many of them made films and movies. I mean, Costa Rica had this incredibly inspiring movie and so on of these people who changed the organization almost overnight. That's occurred, not overnight, but in 90 days. By the way, what does infect mean? Infect means you can explain or describe what an abundance culture is, what a positive organization is. You can illustrate it yourself. And you've attempted a 1% improvement. So there's action involved.
Yeah.
The reason 1% is so important, by the way, if you get in an airplane in, I don't know, Washington, D.C., you go around the world and you're off 1 degree. You're south of Atlanta, north of Bangor, Maine, 620 miles off base. Just 1 degree. You get 135,000 people doing 1%. That's a big change.
The impact would be powerful, and I'm guessing there's also many case studies or potential real life examples where those positive encouragers within workplaces are the ones that are actually ostracized or outcast because they're not fitting in with the company culture of that particular organizer, or they're looked at with suspicion or cynicism. And those organizations, if they're doing that, are probably missing that real vital link between positive culture, encouragement, energy, and the ultimate performance of the organization.
That's really true. I have a good friend. I'll just follow up on that quickly, and I know you've got another question. I have a good friend who's a CEO of an organization. He's been very successful in turning around an organization quite quickly, from big losses to big profitability, big gains. Excuse me. He's sort of a master at turning around organizations. He's done that more than once. He's included a number of sort of 1% changes, 1% improvements in these organizations that he's studied. That he's led. One of them was, for example, he had an organization of about 10,000 people. He assigned everybody in the organization to positively embarrass somebody every day. Okay. What does that mean? That means compliment somebody in front of somebody else who cares.
Wow.
And so they just did those small little things. He turned the place around from a $210 million in the red to about $40 million in the black in 12 months. It was great.
What a good story. So, and just so relevant for many organizations out there today. Positively embarrass someone. I like that. Kim, how do you deal with, like, business is a series of ups and downs, no matter what level of business that you're in, or no matter where you are in your career, there's always these ups and there's always these downs. How do you deal with some of those inevitable troughs that you confront personally?
Yeah, and everyone experiences those. And I wish I was more of a world's expert on how to handle the downside, But I have a principle in mind, Tony, that I believe in. Excuse me. I don't know anybody who rejects virtuous activities over time. I don't, no child I know of has ever said to his mother, "Mom, stop loving me so much. I can't stand this. Please stop." Or, I can understand it being disingenuous. Don't use that technique on me. But kindness is its own reward. The idea that virtuousness will always be self-perpetuating and uplifting, it's a source of energy, is important. I need to give you a study to show you what I really mean by this. So, and it has to do with what do I do when things are downhill and depressing and so on. So in this particular study, they took kidney dialysis patients. These are people hooked up to a kidney dialysis machine. They measured on two factors. One is, to what extent are you being loved, supported, and cared for by somebody? The other factor is, to what extent are you making a difference in somebody else's life, loving, supportive, caring for them? 1 year later, they measured physical health, recovery. Those people who had high scores on supporting, caring for other people were healthier, significantly healthier than those who were receiving support and care. That's confirmed by another study of multiple sclerosis patients, MS patients. And this study was more precisely done. Half of these people were assigned to receive a phone call once a week, having someone express love, support, and concern for them. The other half of these people were assigned to place a phone call. Place a phone call, having someone else supporting, loving, caring for, making a difference in somebody else's life. So one half receiving a phone call, the other half placing a phone call. Well, 2 years later, they measured several factors: physical activity, hope, depression, self-efficacy, confidence, competence, and so on.
Wow.
8-fold difference. 8 times healthier. Those people who placed the phone calls were 8 times healthier than those who received the phone calls. One other study, and then I'm going to summarize these. Study of widows, people who had lost their husbands. Part of these women had very high scores on supporting, caring for, nurturing somebody else in the first 6 months. Another set of these people had received a lot of support, a lot of empathy, a whole bunch of people who were supporting them and expressing sympathy. In that first group, 0 deep depression in the first 6 months. In the second group, 70% deep depression in that group. That is, it was the contribution they made. And here's the summary. Especially in down times, turns out contribution is a lot better than receipt. Making a difference in somebody else's life tends to elevate all of us. And there's, again, some more studies about that, which I won't take time to keep repeating. But the idea is physical health, mental health, emotional health. When we contribute, we're a lot better off. There was I got to tell you one. There's a study of heart disease patients. Half of these people were assigned to keep a gratitude journal. That is, once a day, just write down 3 things for which you're grateful. You know about this. The other half of these people didn't keep a journal. 2 months later, only 8 weeks later, they measured heart health. Those people keeping a gratitude journal were healthier in their heart. They deteriorated less and healed more in just 8 weeks than the other group. All right, the whole point of that is virtuousness in a lot of ways. And these are, I'm just talking about 2 things: being generous, contributing, and expressing gratitude, being being appreciative. Those two things are ways to lift yourself out of the doldrums.
Yeah.
There are others.
That is so compelling, isn't it? It's you're giving to receive, more or less. The internal benefits to the gifting or contributing is just it's such
true.
a powerful. Yeah, Kim, how can people connect with you?
Well, they're certainly welcome. The easiest way is just an email.
Yeah.
Which is my name with an underscore in the middle, Kim, Kim, underscore Cameron, Cameron, at, it's University of Michigan, by the way. So it's at umich.edu. So Kim underscore Cameron at umich.edu is the easiest.
Excellent.
I'm happy to respond, happy to be available. And especially, Tony, I am happy to have as many opportunities as I can to send people toward your podcast. You are making such a difference in the world, and it's just a real delight to be with you.
I really appreciate that. So, and your book is called Positively Energizing Leadership, Virtuous Actions and Relationships That Create High Performance. And that's obviously available now through all the normal channels. It's on Amazon, no doubt. And
right.
That certainly making a difference. Dr. Kim, it's been a real pleasure having you today on the Today's Leader podcast. Thank you so much for investing in the leaders of today.
I'm honored, Tony. Thank you so very much.